Liberalism, section. What is radicalism? The contrast with liberalism. Formed in the wake of disappointment in the English and American models, how did, quote, radicalism differ from liberalism? The answer is obvious if we refer to authors like Locke and Calhoun, profoundly liberal, and yet at the same time without any doubts as to the legitimacy of black slavery. The answer is not even difficult if we draw a comparison with authors such as Burke, Jefferson, and Acton, who, notwithstanding reservations and criticisms of the institution, on various grounds represented ideological and political reference points for the slaveholding South, or even continued to defend it to the end. The line of demarcation also proves sufficiently clear if we compare authors like Blackstone and Montesquieu, who tended to contest, quote, slavery among ourselves, rather than slavery as such, with a radicalism committed to rejecting both the spatial delimitation, the English model until 1833, and the racial delimitation, the American model until 1865, of the community of the free. But how is de Tocqueville clearly distinguished from authors like Diderot, Condorcet, and Schulker, whom I have included in the process of French radicalism's formation and development? What sense does it make to situate in two different, even opposed formations, de Tocqueville and Condorcet, who were, respectively, one of the great critics of the Terror and one of its most illustrious victims? Is it right to include in the same party French and American radicals who adopted such a different attitude towards Christianity? Before answering these questions, it is worth lingering over something that characterized the liberal tradition from its outset. Let us take authors like Montesquieu, Smith, and Millar. Although condemning slavery more or less sharply, all three continued to regard England, a country in the front rank in the slave trade, as a model. In no instance did criticism or condemnation of slavery involve exclusion of the beneficiaries or theorists of the institution from the community of the free and the Liberal Party. On more than one occasion, Burke distanced himself from the institution of slavery, but when conflict between the two Atlantic shores erupted, he not only celebrated the love of liberty which particularly animated Southern colonies, but disdainfully rejected the idea that, in an attempt to suppress the rebellion, appeal might be made to, quote, servile hands. In other words, the British Whig continued to include slave owners in the community of the free, while excluding a priori their victims. Criticism of the institution of slavery was clear and firm in Hume, but this did not prevent him from asserting that, quote, European nations represented that part of the globe which maintains sentiments of liberty, honor, equity, and valor superior to the rest of mankind, end quote. By contrast, there was reason to believe that blacks were, quote, naturally inferior to the whites, and inferior to the point of lacking any symptoms or ingenuity and free spirit, end quote. So, once again, despite the condemnation of slavery, it was its beneficiaries, not its victims, who formed an integral part of the community of the free and the Liberal Party. The boundaries of the community of the free could lose something of their naturalistic rigidity, but the rituals of self-celebration and the enormous repression it was based on persisted. In 1772, Arthur Young calculated that, out of 775 million global inhabitants, only 33 million enjoyed liberty, and they were concentrated in a fairly restricted zone of the planet, excluding Asia, Africa, and virtually all of America, as well as the southern and eastern parts of Europe itself. This was the theme subsequently taken up and eloquently developed by Adam Smith. Beginning of long quote. We are apt to imagine that slavery is quite extirpated because we know nothing of it in this part of the world. But even at present, it is almost universal. A small part of the west of Europe is the only portion of the globe that is free from it, and is nothing in comparison with the vast continents where it still prevails. End quote. In similar vein, Millar contrasted, quote, Great Britain, in which liberty is generally so well understood and so highly valued, with all those tribes of barbarians in different parts of the world, with which we have any correspondence, and among whom the practice of domestic slavery continued to rage. End quote. Europe and the West were complacently depicted as a tiny island of liberty and civilization in a tempestuous ocean of tyranny, slavery, and barbarism. In order to indulge in such self-celebration, Young, Smith, and Millar were in fact obliged to overlook a far from trivial detail, the slave trade, which involved the most brutal form of slavery, chattel slavery, and in which Western Europe, starting precisely with liberal England, was engaged for centuries. De Tocqueville's attitude was not very different. When he published Democracy in America, there were few countries or colonies in the Western Hemisphere where slavery persisted, since it had been abolished in much of Latin America and the British colonies. In the interval between the publication of the first and second volumes of this work, the United States introduced into Texas the institution that should have been synonymous with the absolute power of man over man. But this prompted no uncertainty in the French liberal when it came to identifying the American continent as the locus of liberty. Volume 1 of Democracy in America appeared shortly after the abolition of slavery in the British colonies. But that would appear to have been an irrelevant event in the opinion of de Tocqueville, who, when it came to comparing England and the United States, had no doubt that the latter country most fully embodied the cause of liberty. And Jefferson, the president, slave owner, and unyielding opponent of the country born out of a revolution by black slaves, seemed to the French liberal to be, quote, the greatest democrat whom the democracy of America has as yet produced. End quote. Lincoln himself initially conducted the Civil War as a crusade against rebellion and separatism, not for the abolition of slavery, which could continue to survive in states loyal to central government. It was only later, with the recruitment of blacks into the Union Army, and hence with the direct intervention of slaves and ex-slaves in the conflict, that the Civil War between whites was transformed into a revolution, conducted partly from above and partly from below, making the abolition of slavery inevitable. But in the first phase of the war, the Union did not a priori exclude slave states from its bosom, just as liberal critics of the institution of slavery did not expel those who had a different and even contrary position on the problem from the Liberal Party. The tendency we are examining finds fullest expression in Libe. Cautious criticisms of the institution of slavery did not prevent him, even on the immediate eve of the Civil War, from attributing to the United States, the country that even more than England embodied the great cause of, quote, liberal institutions and self-government, the, quote, great mission of spreading liberty throughout the world. Every American must always bear in mind the grandeur of the constitutional principles and texts of his country. Otherwise, they would resemble the missionary that should proceed to convert the world without Bible or prayer book. End quote. While it was the sacred text of liberty for the liberal author, for the radicals Garrison and Phillips, the U.S. Constitution, which sanctioned slavery and the racial state, was an instrument of Satan. Over and above the very different significance assigned to the problem of slavery, here we have two opposed delimitations of political geography, of the camp of friends and enemies. Notwithstanding the argument and conflict over slavery, liberalism's various exponents continue to recognize themselves as members of the same party and the same community of the free. By contrast, excluded from it were blacks, whom, at an interval of decades, Jefferson and Lincoln intended to deport from the Union, and who, not by chance, after emancipation, first in the North and then in the South, did not come to enjoy either political or civil equality. Montesquieu and de Tocqueville, not to mention Libe and Acton, could indeed criticize slavery, but it was understood that their interlocutors were not black slaves, but their masters. The latter were called upon to demonstrate moral sensitivity and political consistency, and hence agreed to expunge a stain that has affected the credibility of the community of the free as such. Condorcet's attitude was very different. Here is how he addressed the black slaves in 1781. Beginning of long quote. Dear friends, although I am not the same color as you, I have always regarded you as my brothers. Nature has fashioned you to have the same spirit, the same reason, and the same virtues as whites. I am only speaking here of whites in Europe, for when it comes to whites in the colonies, I shall not insult you by comparing them to you. Should one set off in search of a man in the islands of America, one would certainly not find him among the populations of white flesh. End quote. The French philosopher was not yet aware of it, but the ruling group in the North American Republic was on the point of being situated outside not only the Party of Liberty, but even the human race. What we have here is a political and ideological current different from liberalism, the radicalism that had been formed or was in the process of being formed. It might seem debatable to apply this category to an author who recommended extreme gradualism in the process of abolishing slavery, but that is not the main point. Marat himself, in 1791, proposed, quote, gradually to prepare the transition from slavery to liberty, end quote, and yet already unequivocally condemning, quote, the barbarism of the colonists. It was not to them that he looked to make the desired change, and not even to the National Assembly, which, coming to terms with the slaveholders, rode roughshod over the rights of man and the, quote, sacred foundations of the Constitution. The actual interlocutors tended to be the black slaves themselves, as would become clear in the course of Marat's subsequent evolution. As for Condorcet, despite the gradualist character of his abolitionism, he deflected back onto the slaveholding whites the dehumanizing drive they had mobilized against blacks. This was an attitude that could also develop on the basis of a profoundly Christian consciousness. Here is how Garrison expressed himself in 1841 on the subject of slave owners. Beginning of long quote. No political, no religious co-partnership should be had with them, for they are the meanest of thieves and the worst of robbers. We should as soon think of entering into a compact with the convicts at Botany Bay and New Zealand. We do not acknowledge them to be within the pale of Christianity, of republicanism, of humanity. End quote. But some decades earlier, the English abolitionist Percival Stockdale had already declared, quote, we are the savages. The Africans act like men, like beings endowed with rational and immortal minds. End quote. Once again, indignation at the treatment inflicted on the black slaves could even conduce to a dehumanization of the dehumanizers. In regarding slaves as their interlocutors, radicals did not hesitate to appeal to a revolution from below by victims of the institution it was intended to abolish. Even prior to the revolution by San Domingo's slaves, Raynal and Diderot's History of the Two Indias evoked a massive uprising, led by a black Spartacus, which might involve replacing the Code Noir in force by a, quote, Code Blanc, that repaid the slaveholders for the injustices they had committed. Within the liberal tradition, in Smith we can come across evocation of a dictatorship from above, putting an end to the scandal of an institution that sullied the community of the free, but certainly not hopes for a revolution from below. We know the sympathy or admiration with which Gregoire and Schulker viewed Toussaint Louverture and Haiti. These are two names that do not appear in de Tocqueville. In connection with San Domingo, he limited himself to mentioning the, quote, bloody catastrophe that has put an end to its existence, end quote. Paradoxically, the island ceased to exist the moment it put to an end, for the first time in the Americas, the institution of slavery. Finally, Diderot reported an observation by Helvetius, quote, what is the cause of England's extreme power? Its government. End quote. He followed up this assessment with a polemical question, quote, but what is the cause of the extreme poverty of Scotland and Ireland? End quote. Judgment of the metropolis could not be separated from judgment of the colonies and semi-colonies. From the standpoint of authors like Diderot and Schulker, England and the United States, the holy sites of liberty in de Tocqueville's view, were responsible for the most ferocious and barbarous despotism. Even when it criticized slavery, the liberal tradition did not question the identification of the West with civilization, and of the colonial world with barbarism. Radicalism's position was different. In the first instance, it identified and denounced barbarism in those responsible for, and complicit with, the most macroscopic violation of the rights and dignity of man. Marx and Engels may be regarded as critical inheritors of radicalism. For the first in particular, not only was it epistemologically and politically arbitrary to ignore the politico-social reality of the colonies, but, as we shall see, those colonies were the requisite starting point for understanding the, quote, barbarism of bourgeois society. End of section.